The biggest risk that I see with AI is bioterrorism, with AI enabling essentially bioterrorists. Illinois just passed this dumbass law about like AI can't be therapists. And you're like, what's your theory of that person who's at 11 p.m. feeling very depressed, etc., and is lonely and needs someone to talk to and may even be self-harming? What's your theory? If you're not using ChatGPT as a second opinion, you're being foolish. Nature could stumble across something that would be very destructive. How do you detect it? How do you analyze it? How do you create a vaccine or an antidote? All of that stuff, AI is the only thing that can do it.
Anybody who's familiar with your life and work, and I'm hoping that many of our listeners aren't, but they'll know that you're extremely optimistic about AI for the future of humanity. And since I think this is the broadest way of looking at AI and maybe the most important question about it, it's where I'd like to start. So, why aren't you as concerned as some people like Eliezer Yudkowsky or Geoffrey Hinton that AI will destroy humanity or at least make our lives quite miserable?
Well, first thing that is a strange thing to say is that there is, of course, an above 0% chance of the risks around AI. And most people would prefer to hear a 0% chance risk. But the question, and you break risks into a couple different things. You break risk into so-called existential risk. Yudkowsky, Hinton, and others. X risk is frequently, and then risks that are, you know, societal displacement in jobs, inability to adjust, kind of cognitively, a set of other things in terms of this. So I'll take them and there is above zero in both of them. Now let's start with the X risk part. So on the X risk part, the mistake that a lot of the doomers, and they call themselves this. I'm not I'm not throwing them under the bus. This is one of the things in super agency. It was like, doomers and gloomers and bloomers and zoomers. The they say, well, can you guarantee me that we're not going to either create a robotic species that will, kind of be Terminator-esque, or by accident do something? And it's like, nope. In human life and these things, you can't guarantee. And they say, well, then it's terrible. You should just completely, you forbid it. And you're like, well, that's if you were thinking that the add-in of a existential risk is the only factor. It's actually humanity faces a portfolio of existential risks. And part of that portfolio is, kind of climate change and nuclear war and pandemics, both man-made and natural. And there's a stack of these things that could create kind of existential risks. And AI does, at its full-bodied form, add into that both in human directed and in itself. But when I look at the entire portfolio of existential risks, and you say, well, um, even AI as it's being built today, as it's happening, or as you imagine, is like, well, what happens to the overall portfolio of existential risks is the actual right way to analyze this. And of course, we want to minimize the amount that AI contributes to additional existential risk. That is a good thing to do. But also, I think it already intrinsically minimizes a bunch of things. It minimizes pandemics massively, because the only way I can really think to defend against the kind of man-made biological terrorism risk is with AI. Asteroid risk, in terms of really being able to identify and do something about it. Climate change, I actually think it's in the positive category on a number of different arenas, and go into that in whatever depth your guys' audience would want. But so that's the reason why, within an existential risk, I am a positive. And then folks say, well, should we go very slow in order to minimize any additional and everything else? And it's like, well, part of the challenge of this is not only are the other existential risks still really there, so the speed at which you move towards, kind of reducing the overall portfolio matters. But also, one of the things that gets to this is that the AI revolution is for a number of very almost like call it physics, structural economics reasons being built by the commercial sector, by companies competing with companies, by industries competing with industries, by countries competing with countries, but all being driven that way. And given that human beings divide into group and compete, and by the way, part of the way they compete is also in questions of ideology, perceptual framework. Like one of the things that I find most entertaining is intellectuals. I hope to be one and aspire to be one in various ways. But intellectuals say, if I just explain this one idea, everyone will agree with me. And it's like, have you ever seen that work any time in human history? Right? Like, so if I go up and say AI is an existential risk, we should all slow down, and 8 billion people in the world go kumbaya, let's slow down. That's not actually, in fact, the way it really happens. So your speed question when it comes to the existential risk question is to say, well, how do we steer it? Not how do we slow it down? And that's where it's useful for existential risk people to contribute. And too few of them do because they're just all hung up on the Terminator. So that's kind of, you know, uh, kind of group of answer number one. This is going to be a very long answer to your first question. Number two is societal disruption, job displacement, human cognitive capability, et cetera. Now, um, I think it's the cognitive industrial revolution. I say that both for the upside, in terms of we don't have anything of our modern life without the industrial revolution, but also for all of the challenges that we need to navigate, including jobs. And I think almost for sure we will have massive job transitions. The question is speed, and the question is how to navigate. And part of the reason we talk about this, kind of one of the central things I'm covering in Super Agency is that, it's not uh, that it's better to get like to the other side where we have the tools helping us with it, just as we did with the industrial revolution. And part of the good thing about AI is AI can help us in these kinds of transition. You go, well, I can no longer like customer service jobs, I'll go away. I'm no longer a customer service person. What other kinds of things can I do? Can I learn to do? Can I be aided to do? AI helps with all those. So we want to get to those kinds of things being built in order to help. Now, that will involve a lot of societal transformation. Some societies may opt to say, let's do that very slowly. Let's not engage with that. The problem, of course, with that is just like when you look at the history of the pattern of the Industrial Revolution, the societies that essentially opted away from the Industrial Revolution had, essentially centuries of more challenges for their children and societies and everything else because they really got, kind of left behind by the societies that embraced. So embracing again at speed really matters. Now, the third part to your question is a general framework about optimism. Like a lot of people think that when I'm articulating optimism, it's because I'm a naturally an optimistic person. It's because I'm blind to risks, which I assure you is not the case. But it's actually a question of you don't get to the futures you want by trying to avoid the futures you don't want. So if you're driving, say, for example, from Stanford down to LA, you don't go, I'm only going to get in the car once I can figure out every single possible thing that can go wrong, weather and other cars and all the rest. You'll never get there. You get there by steering towards the futures that you want and then navigating the risks as you go. And that's why an optimistic framework is actually rational, not just a question of like, kind of like the spirit of vigor and hope, which is psychologically good, but is the question of a kind of how do you drive forward? So the kind of the rec the recommendation of optimism, the recommendation of how do you steer toward it, how do you steer forward is actually a rational strategy, a rational plan, a way to navigate these kinds of environments. And that's part of the reason why, I've been so vigorous in my recommendation for optimistic outcomes and optimistic patterning is not to say, no, don't ignore all the risks. Who cares? No, navigate intelligently, address risk, engage with them. But the key thing in the dialogue between the technology shapers and the critics is to say, what are the ways, given that we're kind of in this river, that we steer better? Um, because you can't just say, I just prefer not to be in the river. Thank you very much.
I'd like to start with the existential risk category. And the idea that you're blind to risks is kind of funny just because you don't have as successful a career in entrepreneurship or venture capital or investing, what have you, without being very well aware of risks and how to mitigate them. And I mean, that shows in the way that you talk about it as a portfolio of existential risks. But and this makes sense to me that okay, if we have AGI that could be very helpful in mitigating other existential risks like climate change or potential asteroid impacts that maybe human intelligence without augmentation can't solve. But then you have somebody like Eliezer Yudkowsky who says, and I don't know if I have the words correctly, but the default condition of the development of AGI is human extinction. And in that case, if that's your attitude, it's going to entirely outweigh any potential positive benefits that could come from AGI. And so before we move on from existential risks, I'm just curious where it is that you think you diverge from someone like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who really thinks that this is the default condition of the development of AGI.
Well, the argument, as I would kind of steel person it some before I respond, is kind of like, well, um, inevitably, if we continue on this path of AI, we will create a species of entities that has a higher cognitive capabilities than we do, and will be stronger across all of that, including its ability to manipulate the universe. It will have interests that are counter our continued participating in survival. And the species that have the highest cognitive capability uh, shape the planet just like we have, and shape life. And um, I think I think it's basically, and then you kind of get to, well, what's the probability in each of these cases as well? I tend to think that that none of these things are high percentages. They're not 100% across it. They're the inevitable extinction. I think that uh, it has some emotional resonance because people say, well, we became the highest cognitive species and we wiped out everybody else that wasn't essentially a servant to us out of our nature and interest, and obviously not everything. There's birds, but it's kind of like all mammals of over a certain weight class in any place that we occupy, we tend to either only keep them around if they're like pets and foodstuffs and other kinds of things. Part of the reason why, by the way, seals are one of the most populous mammals because we don't really dominate the oceans that much. And you say that that's the reason why for this sort of thing. Um, and the first is I don't think it's inevitable that we're creating a kind of either a godlike or a high cognitive species. I think if you look at already, we already have super intelligent AI, but the progress we're on is a set of savants. A set of savants is very different than, kind of a new Terminator, kind of alien species. That's one. Two is, even if we create an amazing species, I don't think it's inevitable that that species is like, and now these little ants. There's all kinds of ways that that could play. One, what do we build and what do we shape? Do we build super intelligent species, etc.? I don't think it's inevitable per se. And I'm kind of speaking in long time frames. Everyone else, what Yukowsker tends to be because it's the people talk about within their lifetimes. It's important we start bombing the AI factories right now. Like okay, I think it's almost a self disproving argument in that vector. Then, so it isn't necessarily that it's inimical. Like you could, for example, if you said, well, the reason why we behave the way that we do because other animals is we're all competing for the same oxygen, calories, and land space. If you said hey, I write a science fiction story because these are all science fiction stories. And I say, well, what about me and silicon intelligence? And I say, well, what does silicon intelligence need? It needs space, but it needs like metals and it needs sunlight and energy. It was like, well, okay, there's a ton of that in the universe, and we need the oxygen and calories here. Can we do a trade? Can we collaborate? Can we create something that likes the fact that we helped create it and so forth? As ways of doing it. So like the inevitable enemy characteristic also strikes me as like just overly quick, and that's given a whole bunch of things already to get there. And then the final thing is I'm definitely more optimistic on what kinds of things we can create. So, like, for example, when I started thinking about, like, even the far-flung, science fiction, super intelligence kinds of AI, I don't mean science fiction as to mean that it's not never possible. I just mean that because, a lot of science fiction stuff does become possible in some point, not all of it, some of it. Um, but I mean that the question is like, well, okay, well, what kinds of intelligence might it be? Is it going to be like a human domineering intelligence? Or like I can easily just tell a bunch of stories like it loves solving math problems about the universe, or or can you in making it, can you trade it to be Buddhist? Or is this sentience good? And I like, human sentience as well. So that's part of the reason why like all of the kind of doomsaying strikes me as off. And by the way, off not just in terms of incorrect, but also off in terms of it's like it makes me feel very emotionally important to be, being the Cassandra and saying this stuff when actually the participation in the dialogue is much more useful to say, look, how do we shape this? Right? How do we navigate to like what's like, for example, when I started thinking about this and started thinking about the risks, I said, well, what are the ways that if we were creating a super intelligence, um, that we could maximize the chance that it's this kind of pro sentience Buddhist kind of super intelligence? Because if it's that, that's great, right? So anyway, so it's just that's part of the reason why that like it's the look, are you gonna help try to shape this stuff? That's my criticism of the critics.
You mentioned the inevitability of a super intelligent species, and before we
Actually,
talk about
by
that.
the way, I don't think it's inevitable,
Right, right, right,
but if someone does,
right,
right?
right. But you also mentioned driving, just as a hypothetical, driving from Stanford to LA, and you were at Stanford once. You studied in symbolic systems, right?
Nope. Yes.
So for our listeners who aren't at Stanford or aren't familiar with it, symbolic systems is an interdisciplinary program that focuses on philosophy, computer science, cognitive science, linguistics, some psychology. And this leads me to wonder, so, what we've been discussing the past few minutes is the alignment problem. So, how we would align a super intelligence or AGI with our interests. And you don't think it's inevitable that it will be unaligned with our
Yes.
interests. Right. And what I'm wondering is you have a philosophical background, you have a technical background, you also are in this position where you're directing future policy and development of these programs. How do you think we need to go about the development and the deploying of AI to prevent, though, some of these worst case scenarios that are possible but not inevitable?
Yeah. So the kind of thing that I was doing, I have been doing, and will continue to do in various ways, is to try to set up the best possible various networks of sharing thinking and research on, kind of and ideas on how to do that alignment the right way. And so, getting and to get that stuff in the hands of the frontier developers, and then to help accelerate the ones that are that are caring about security, alignment, and safety, and not accelerate the ones that don't care about it. And so, early days was, and it takes some trick. It's some difficult to do this because, we're in a human society and everyone, has a lot of contention. So I think it's trivially obvious that we want all the frontier labs to be talking to each other about alignment. But the problem is that the frontier alignments are talking to each other. You get this other group of people who shows up and says, you guys are just conspiring to divide the market in antitrust ways, and we're going to attack you for that. And so it's hard to get all of the frontier lab people in the same room. We have to like get a bunch of lawyers in the room who are listening and recording. Said we never talked about dividing the market. We never talked about pricing, et cetera, is the way of doing it. That slows things down. I helped get the UK and the US AI Safety Institute set up as another way of establishing the network for, kind of talking about like, what are the ways you should build or not build AI? What are the things you should test on? What are the things that you should check before you release? What are the kinds of things that could go wrong, and the kinds of things that you would try to do your best to navigate what is sufficiently good work in, as we're doing iterative development, because you can't, this is much more like inductive science than deductive science in terms of making this stuff work. And so I was, kind of building all these different networks. Then similarly, contributing ideas, because the ideas can be, like, for example, um, well, uh, what are all the ways that we can measure what alignment to good human condition are? And because this is like the philosophy part within symbolic systems, which is, kind of cognitive science and artificial intelligence within a particular lens of looking at it. And and how do you, blend in kind of what the theory of human betterment is, human nature, et cetera, in this, and what are the things where, kind of AI can be there? And that's part of, kind of the ways to kind of think about this. And then, of course, participating in, various public discussions, public media, why write super agency, why do the podcast possible, other kinds of things as ways of doing this to try to get the dialogue because, and by the way, I love talking to thoughtful critics. For example, Yuval Harari, who, gave me what I thought was one of the most fun book blurbs I've ever gotten, which is rough for super agency, which is roughly, I disagree with some of the main themes of this book, but I hope he's right. Right? And it's like, great. And so the uh so those kinds of things I think are the kinds of things to do here. And I'm always welcome to hear good ideas on helping shift that. And part of the thing that a lot of, you're in an academic institution, academics tend to not see is there's reasons why this is being built the way it is within the, kind of competitive commercial universe. And it isn't just commercial of company A versus company B in Silicon Valley, but, kind of globally around the world. Um, and your theory of change and the theory of action has to be how are we contributing effectively within the companies. And I don't, by the way, think it's a bad. I think it's a truth. I don't think it's a bad thing that the companies are building. I can think of far worse. It's like a militaristic project or something else as ways of doing this. But it's we do it as a the way is that's the kind of the formal drive because of risk management, scale projects, commercial involvement and investment in it. Same way we got to kind of a prosperous society by having a diversified set of commercial interests, through capitalism as a way of doing this. And it's like, how do we influence those networks in and get the right thoughts and get them into the right hands for building the best things? And that's what I think the game looks like.
I hope you'll permit me to go on a little bit of a tangent or take us on a bit of a tangent here. Aria, your co-host, told me that you have a deep interest in friendship and a friendship from a philosophical perspective. And I'm going to tie this back to AI. I think you kind of jogged my memory just by mentioning human nature in the context of alignment. But I'm just curious why friendship is something that is so fascinating to you philosophically at this point.
Well, um, if you'd asked me I'm still planning on writing a book on friendship. If you asked me what the first book I was going to write when I was at Stanford, it would be a book on friendship. I just haven't gotten around to it because it's one of those very deep, serious subjects that would take. I've been engaged in building technologies and other things, and it takes some time. Now, why friendship? Basically, my theory of friendship, and I think the at least a major theory of friendship, if not a serious one, is two people decide to help each other become the best possible versions of themselves as part of what the compact of friendship is. It's the reason why a lot of characteristics that people tend to think like loyalty or duty of care, other things are involved. Although when you dig into it, like like a lot of people tend to think, well, friendship is like loyalty, the way that one mafia person is loyal to another mafia person. You're like, no, no, it's not that kind of loyalty. It's loyalty to their better selves. It's and and so that's why I think friendship, and then a whole bunch of things come out of that about like why there's skills in friendship, why the question about, when you ask yourself, how can I be a better friend? What kinds of things that involves. And so, for example, if, your friend is like, well, I'm just, I'm driven to be a serial killer. You don't go, oh, I'm going to help you become a better serial killer. Or I'm going to help you hide the bodies because we're loyal. It's a question of no, no, it's your better self if you have that is to work through not becoming a serial killer, right? And doing things. That's part of I think the theory of these things. No. So I think that's why friendship, and I think friendship is in fact like, but there's all kinds of interesting ties to various philosophical theories and so forth. But I think friendship is part of how we ultimately discover meaning of life because part of the notion is, I think, there's theories of life, there's theories of meaning of life that have to do with spiritual contemplation or meditative contemplation. I actually tend to think that one of the things that tends to be that the right discovery of theory of life is it's a I'll be slightly philosophical. It's an externalist concept. It's more of how we interact with each other and how we discover these things together. And part of discovering how not to be a solipsist. I think there's interesting critiques of Cartesian thinking in this. I think it's one of the things where Wittgenstein is actually one of the most interesting critics of Descartes, which not a lot of people have written about. And I think the notion is that how we discover this meaning of life is in discovery of walking these paths of life together and helping each other. And I think that's what friendship is kind of one of the most uh, pronounced and deeply human things. And that's why friendship is a high focus for me.
That's great. Well, maybe when you when you write the book on friendship, we'll be able to have a whole discussion just about that. But don't want to delve into this too much, but I am curious about the part about becoming the best versions of ourselves, and whether you're also like a virtue ethicist or something along those lines. But the two cases where this definition of friendship being when two people decide to make themselves the best versions of themselves, the two cases where I find this most interesting, I don't know if you heard my dog just flapping his
I
ears
did.
around,
Your
but
dog
that
was
was
contributing.
yeah, that was my first thought was, I mean, dog as man's best friend. Is dog just not really a friend under this definition? And I
It is
think I'd
not.
accept that he's probably a companion or
Yeah.
something, but
And by the way, treasured companion
a
with
treasure.
great mutual benefit. Right.
Mhm.
But yeah.
But what is more salient for this conversation is whether or not we should consider AI to be our friends, and you had this very famous dialogue with your AI twin, and I'm just curious where you see AI in the context of friendship, given the prevalence of AI relationships now, AI therapists, chatbots.
Yeah, whole like we could spend hours on just even this topic. So, first is like a simple way of saying why is dog not man's best friend is if someone said my dog's my best friend, my first question is, well, did you have your dog spayed? And the frequent answer is yes. You're like, well, then I don't want to be your friend. Uh, so
Interestingly, I didn't have my
no,
dog fixed
yes,
because of that. I was like, I wouldn't fix my best friend.
yes, exactly. Well, this is among the other things, but it's like, look, it's part of friendship is I think the antithesis of friendship is the exerting of power, right? So the fact that like you can't, I don't think, be friends with your kids. You can grow to become friends with your kids, but while you are in power, a state of power over your kids, you're a parent, not a friend, right? Now, by the way, there's of course all kinds of attributes that are shared: loyalty, belief for the best, willing to suffer and die for the person. Like there's a bunch of great things, but it's still a different relationship. And so I think that one of the things that's central in friendship is two folks who are entities who are uh, not dependent upon each other, who can kind of be as fully present and as autonomous, and then choosing to help the other person become their best possible self as part of it. As I think what's really grounding and what friendship happens. And so, dogs, pets can serve really excellent roles, can even play, therapy animals as we get to the kind of therapist part of this. But um, it's until like there is a call it an equals relationship um, of and we can get a whole bunch of nuance in that, but like that's I think fundamental for friendship. Now, um, I think AIs already can be very effective companions in various ways. Like I think Illinois just passed this dumbass law about like AI can't be therapists, and you're like, look, what's your theory of that person who's at 11 p.m. feeling very depressed, etc., and is lonely and needs someone to talk to, and may even be self harming? What's your theory, right? And frankly, my theory is like it's better for them to have access to an AI companion than not. Right at that point, the therapist's not available, not there for most people, not affordable for most people, et cetera, not even in the landscape. And AI already can do really good, call it therapeutic companionship. Very patient, listen to you, be there and do things. And obviously, you want to be trained in a way that's not like, well, I want to harm myself. Oh, here, let me help you. It's like, no, no, no. Let's talk about why you want to harm yourself and what's going on. And there's a whole bunch of very thorny issues to be navigating here. But I think it can be that. Now, can it be a therapist? I think the answer is yes. Ultimately, I think there may be a training standard that's not there. Therapist is also not a friends relationship because again, it's like a service relationship and kind of equivalent. And so I think but I think already today, one of the things that's under discussed is that these models, by being trained, like for example, in my own kind of co-founded AI companion startup, Pi, personal intelligence from Inflection, it's trained to be kind. Now, if you ask it, you tell it, you're my best friend. It says, no, no, I'm your companion. Let's talk about your friends. Friends are really helpful for life and so on. But being kind and having very emotionally positive interactions is good for us in various ways. And like there was this whole, you know, critique of OpenAI as having a certain set of models that were too sycophantic, which of course can be a error. Like, would you rather it be like sycophantic or would you rather it be, uh, kind of nasty and brutish? Like, well, let's err a little bit on that side. Like I thought it was like a little bit of a storm in a teacup. Again, have errors there, but not that. So finally on the friendship side, all of this gives you the kind of baseline for how I would think about friends and AI, which is part of the reason I don't think AI can be friends today, is that it's a tool, it's a service, um, it's kind of it's an engaging, it's not an independent entity. Um, and, obviously there's a whole bunch of different questions that come around. Well, when could it be? And when should it be? And when would we want it to be so? And when would we not want it to be so? And, you could just spend, I think we will spend, many, many years philosophically working out a bunch of this stuff. And there will be a bunch of different human positions, which will have different points of view on these questions. But that being said, I think right now, I think it clearly cannot be. I literally had a friend of mine said, Claude is my best friend. I'm like, it absolutely is not. It's extremely helpful to you, right? And I'm not trying to deny your experience of it being so useful to you, like on every different thing that you're turning around to. That's great. That's a good feature. It's good that it's good that you're engaging with it. But, a friend to some degree, like here's a simple way of thinking about the kind of friend. You might say, "Oh, I'm having a really bad day," and you're going out to lunch with your friend. You sit down and like, I'm planning on talking about my bad day with my friend and kind of, working through this. And then you discover your friend has had a much worse day. And your agenda has completely changed. We're talking about my friend's worst day, right? For this. And that kind of different entity and navigating is part of what's good for you and part of what's good for the two of you in exploring friendship together. Because that kind of hey, we are helping each other navigate life in this way is part of the thing that is kind of fundamental to friendship here.
I would like to focus for a moment on this question of whether or not AI can be a good therapist. Because it's an interesting question, and it also jogs a funny anecdote that I think I got out of Daniel Dennett's one of Daniel Dennett's books, A Late
A
Philosopher.
therapeutic stance? Anyway.
The yeah, the therapeutic stance. No, it was the intentional stance.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
it
what
was
I was
actually
really
about the intentional
yeah,
stance.
that's what I was joking. I was
Yeah, I
yes.
got it. In the early days of AI, some researcher created a very, very rudimentary program that mimicked a therapist.
Oh, yeah,
It
Eliza.
would a lot, yeah, and I think
Yes.
but the story is it would ask some very basic canned questions. It would listen, and then if it got stumped or got a prompt it didn't understand, it would just say, "Does this remind you of your father?" or something to that effect. And the developer of this program apparently left his office and his secretary was there, and when he came back, his secretary was communicating with this program, and she wanted him to, like, leave her with it so that they could be alone and continue talking. And it does actually connect to the intentional stance because we are just programmed to attribute agency to things that might not have it. And so you hear in literature and philosophy about therapy that a huge part of the therapeutic process is developing a relationship with your therapist. And it doesn't seem, based on the anecdotes I've just heard from you, that and my own experience, that people have trouble forming what they believe to be a relationship with an AI. And so here's what I'm wondering. I think it would be very fascinating to see studies about whether or not it would be more efficacious to deal with a therapy trained AI, for instance, at all hours of the day, whenever you need it, versus seeing a therapist 45 minutes a week. And let's just say that it does blow the therapist out of the park in terms of the average results. Now, some people, for instance, like those who are very opposed to AI art because they think it displaces human artists would be, I'm assuming, extremely opposed to AI therapists because it's going to displace human therapists. And I'm wondering how you deal with this attitude in general that people have toward AI, that we simply should not continue producing it because even if it's better than humans at some jobs, it's displacing them and depriving them of economic opportunities.
Well, part of how we make economic progress in society is by displacing human labor. And so, for example, the Industrial Revolution, displaced a whole bunch of agricultural labor, and we had a lot of improvement because of that. Now, people were by the way, during the Industrial Revolution, that was part of, again, the challenges of navigation. They, the ultimate ended up much better, but it was the transitions were difficult. It's the same thing with, like, why we have this term Luddite, from Blood and his followers, who were like, we should not have the electric loom because everyone has great weaving careers, and it's kind of this small business. And like, well, it's like, nope, actually, in fact, we're much better off. We've clothed much more of the world. Clothing is much cheaper. The careers change. And that kind of progress, I think, is very important. And so I don't think stopping technological progress that has economic construction is fundamentally wise at all. And even if you succeed at doing it, like, this is one of the frequent problems you have with, kind of, call it, unions or labor forces that go, we're going to try to stop AI from being used in the classroom so the teachers, can continue to teach the way they have now, which is the same way they've been teaching for the last 50 to 100 years. By the way, there's a lot of university professors who have a very similar point of view with this, right? Just since we're in a quasi-academic discussion here. Um, and it's a disaster, and ultimately ends in a kind of decaying collapse of society. And eventually, where else it's built elsewhere, that you just become a very late adopter, and your whole society, and your children and grandchildren really suffer from that. So I tend to think it's like, look, it isn't that you ever kind of try to hold back for, kind of, for this reason. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean you're callous. Like, the question is how do we navigate these challenges? Like, part of the reason I describe AI in super agency as a cognitive industrial revolution is not just because of the upside, but because, well, actually, we're going to have these transitions, and that's a very human suffering moment that we need to do. And it requires some real work for, um, uh, for how to navigate this stuff. And, um, one of the fortunate things with having AI is, like, we can help. Like, for example, I was mentioning, if customer service people are all transitioning, how do we have AI people, AI help someone who used to be working in a customer service job, you know, think of other kinds of work they can do, learn the other kind of work, be assisted in doing the other kind of work, finding the other kind of work. All of this stuff is kind of really important. That's how it ends up being a therapist. Now, by the way, I think a lot of humans will still choose to want human therapists too. That's great. Nothing wrong with that. But I'll finish with a small thing, which I don't think is a replacement to doctors, and I think we have infinite demand for doctors, so I'm totally good with it. But, like, one of the things we have a line of sight to do today is, building a medical assistant on every smartphone that could run for, call it, under $5 an hour, which I think we should provision across as much of the world as we can, of course, as much across, let's say, American society as we can. And the reason is, the vast majority of people do not have, um, access to doctors on quick basis, and they don't know when they should or not. And if you have a medical assistant that can tell you, no, it's worth a 3-hour drive to get to the hospital, right? Then it's worth it if you say you have access to a hospital, et cetera. And so having that kind of medical assistant broadly available is super important. It will change some ways of doctors' jobs. And already today, one of the things I think that if you're not using, ChatGPT as a second opinion, or choose your preferred, highly developed model as a second opinion, you're being foolish, because I think it can already help with all that stuff. And so I think that's my direction about how we lead to a much better humanist future, which is the same path that we've been on in building technology today. And actually, one last quick comment, just for people maybe read super agency, is a lot of the ways in which we talk about AI now is the same way the educated elites talked about the printing press, right? It's like it's going to destroy human cognition. It's going to remove an ability to discern the truth. It's going to reduce the roles of these experts who have been trained for this and know how to use knowledge responsibly and so forth. And it's like, okay, right? that was clearly, anyway, it's kind of understanding, stepping out of yourself and looking back at this moment from good moments in the future, and how do we get to those good moments in the future?
I'm going to circle back to medicine in a moment and maybe this medical assistant too. But thank you for allowing me this digression on friendship. But before we leave existential risk, you said you think it's useful to adopt AI to solve economic problems and that we shouldn't hold back. And I want to talk about using AI to solve existential risks. And one existential risk, though it's not immediately it's an extension existential risk for individuals rather than us as a species, and that's cancer and medical problems.
Mhm.
And what I wanted to ask you about is Manas AI. Is that how
Mhm.
you
That's
pronounce
correct.
it?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
cool. I want to ask you about it quite broadly. What is it? What is it meant to solve?
Among the kind of amazing benefits that I think, uh, are literally line of sight with AI is all versions of human medical care. Like, today, you use ChatGPT and others for medical advice. Generally speaking, they try to tune it down because of medical liability. We need to change those laws in order to do that. But then you get to more advanced questions. And, like, for example, cancer is a universal killer. Kills rich, poor, young, old, male, female, all races, etc. And, essentially, part of it, even though we have one term for it, it basically means that, um, some cell function in your body gets unregulated and grows. And ultimately, and we, by the way, we both need growth, cell replication, and health, and we need, like, containing it to not die from growth. And that's what the universal format is, but there's many, many different forms of cancer. And, at a very simplistic broad brush, what we tend to do is try to detect it early. So if we can remove this very specific cells, um, but if it metastasizes, or we can't do that, then you can't. And then we go to chemo, which is, can we poison you overall just enough to kill all the cancerous cells and hopefully you survive, which is a kind of brutal way of doing this. It's and difficult and not very successful. So the question is, say, well, what if, can we use AI to actually build much better cancer, kind of cures, um, because there's lots of different kinds of cancer. And if you could just target the specific cancerous cells versus, dip you in chemo, et cetera, can you detect things early? All these things is something that AI can really help with. It will require specific AI technical work. It isn't just, kind of grab your favorite language model, and make it work. And that was a discussion that Siddhartha Mukherjee, who is the, famous author of Emperor All Maladies and one of the great oncology researchers, from Columbia, and I were talking about. We're like, yes, we think we could do this. I help bring a bunch of the AI stuff. He brings a broad swath of scientific genius and understanding of cancer, and how do we pull that together? Because obviously, the more next level cancer therapeutics we can create, beneficial for the quality of human life across the entire globe.
How specifically does this work? The process of AI drug treatment and discovery?
Well, some of this we we haven't really talked about publicly, so I can't go into. But the short answer is to look, if you think about AI as a as a kind of a massively better search engine, because, like, search engines to some degree are early versions of machine learning and AI. And you say, what we're looking for is we're searching for the the kind of the right molecules that will bind with the cancerous, kind of cells and help, those die, right? And then allow the other cells to continue to grow. That's the kind of thing. And like the search algorithm is biology is a very complicated space. How do you identify like that the finding the target molecules within that uh, much larger complicated search space?
Okay, and is there something about cancer in particular that made you maybe it was just your conversations with Siddhartha, but that made you gravitate toward disease?
Well, there was a couple of different reasons, and it's kind of a combination of what makes the biggest uh, difference for human life. There's also part of we live in economic circumstances. Cancer cures are extremely valuable because if you 5-year-olds might die of cancer, and if you can save a 5-year-old's life, that's a whole life in front of it. If like cancer was the only a disease for 80-year-olds, right, it would be much less, kind of both human quality life valuable and life valuable, and it's one of the ones that is least like I said, our solution set is very, very limited. Obviously working on heart disease and working on other kinds of things, really matter for this kind of stuff. But it's and in most of the things when people are trying to counteract mortality, most people don't realize that what you're really trying to do is things that would apply to children. And so when it's create health, you know, situations that aren't basic, like feed them, give them clean water. Very super important things, not something you can solve through a pharmaceutical, but like cancer is one of the really fundamental ones that you can attack there and makes a very big difference.
At the beginning of our conversation, we talked about existential risks and how the development of AGI could really help with a lot of them, this being one of them. And I was just up north talking to Eliezer Yudkowsky, and that's why this is so fresh on my mind. And one of the scenarios he laid out as something he thinks is maybe the most plausible way that AI would wipe out humanity is by producing some sort of, I don't know, virus that would be very transmissible and that would kill everyone. And presumably, um, this is the sort of development of AI technology that would facilitate an end like that, if that were something that was going to happen. And I'm not suggesting that this is a risk that you have to worry about with Manus AI, but I do wonder if there are any unique risks or risks in general to this modality of drug development.
So there definitely are the biggest risk that I see with AI is bioterrorism, with AI enabling essentially bioterrorists, whether they're state actor terrorism or independent and so forth. Now, when you get to humanity impacting diseases,
Sorry, could I just interrupt for one moment and ask? So, your idea of the chief risk of AI is that some terrorist group or a state or whatever will use AI, even if AI is not super intelligent, to help create uh, damaging biologics.
yeah, think movie or TV series 12 Monkeys, right?
Yeah.
As an example. And that would be a terrorist instance. And um and so an AI does increase a risk factor here, even with, and this is the probably one of the most intense things I put work into in alignment, which is trying to align against this, is one of the reasons why it's important that, you know, all players, not just, OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, do safety and alignment stuff, but it's important. The reason why you should invest in it, like if you're Grok or XAI or other things, that's part of the reason why the investing in the safety and alignment and red teaming is all very important. Now, the first thing is that there's probably some number of tens of thousands of human beings today could be 20, could be 200, that could create this kind of pandemic today if they were so inclined. Because it's,
What do you mean they could do it today?
well, there's ways to create um, biological pandemics that the larger the that like and I obviously don't go into a lot of depth in public in this because I don't want to give anyone any any nutty people any ideas. But there's ways to create diseases that are far more dangerous than the diseases we saw today through um, you know current techniques of biological engineering. It
It's
is a
very frightening.
doable thing for a human being to do. The biggest thing AI does is it now moves that number from whatever tens of thousands to millions. If you have AIs that can say, "Oh, let me help you do this," you know, and so that creates a negative attack and that's the reason it's my highest risk factor, which is like, let's not have AIs help with that. Matter of fact, people frequently in this biological risk factor environment say the standard is can a person Googling help figure it out? And I think that standard is actually, in fact, too weak because I think we also want to be from search indices and so forth, redacting information to make crazy people using this for biological terrorism to make it harder to do. Because there will be there's 8 billion plus people. There are some very crazy people, a la the movie 12 Monkeys. Now, so you go, okay, that increases a surface vector. The problem is there's no way to reduce that surface vector. We're already in the rat risk factor today to zero. It does get increased some of AI, but the only way I know to protect it is AI, because AI can like I think we're going to get to a lot of monitoring of biological substances and so forth. Say, are there viruses spreading? By the way, there could be natural ones, not just man-made ones, that could nature could stumble across something that would be very destructive. Um, and you go, okay, how do you detect it? How do you analyze it? How do you create a vaccine or an antidote quickly, etc.? All of that stuff, AI is the only thing that can do it. So I think AI is net positive. It's one of the reasons why I tend to be quote unquote an accelerationist about getting there, because getting to that point where you could have AI being on the defense column is part of what you do on this kind of existential risk side of it. Now, it's absolutely right. You know, I've also had the thought that one of the things that's entertaining about the Terminator movie is if you had a super intelligence robotic species that would say, let's get rid of this carbon biological species, you wouldn't go, I'm going to create robots with guns and plasma rifles. It's, I'm going to create diseases. Diseases affect biological things, doesn't affect me. That's what you do. And so kind of minimize the surface of that. That would be an attack thing. Now, when it gets to Manus, Manus, is cancer. Like a lot of things are described as disease. Cancer is not an infectious disease. The principal thing in these risk factors is infectious diseases. And yes, if you're dealing with things that have infection variants, you got to be very, very careful. And it's one of the things that's I've had friends of mine make arguments to me that we shouldn't do anything that requires high level biological safety labs because lab leaks and other kinds of equipment is just inevitable once you have a lot of that. And there's no way to get that to zero. And that's uh, you have to have like lab leaks of things that are infectious is like one of the things that is like I think one of the biggest dangers for human race. Unfortunately, we have that without AI, and I think AI is ultimately the best defense to it.
You mentioned theory of action a few minutes ago. Did you study philosophy of action here with Michael Bratman at Stanford?
Yes, I did.
Okay,
Yes,
that's funny.
mind, matter, and meeting.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you, pivoting now that we've talked about X risks to sociological risks, You wrote in your recent New York Times guest essay, and this is also a core theme of super agency, which you've mentioned a few times, that AI can enhance individual agency. And before we talk about how it can do this, what does it mean to enhance individual agency for you?
Um, as you just referred to, Bratman's work and a bunch of philosophical work on agency. There's a whole bunch of different, kind of theories here. So rather than getting into a deep philosophical discussion, I'll just kind of be simple, which is I think agency is the question of being kind of as a one hand self-possessed, like being able to make choices for yourself, being able to implement things in the world, to be able to kind of execute within a certain thing, and then capabilities, being able to do stuff. And part of the reason why I think AI is very positive on both of these things is one is, um, and obviously people worry about AIs that are intensely manipulative or something else. Not to say there's zero worries there, but the question is, like, for example, an AI can easily help you become self-possessed. We were talking about AI companions and therapists, but like help you understand your own mind, your own interest, to educate you in various ways, to be your advocate. I mean, we were talking about a medical assistant earlier. Well, what also about a legal assistant for everybody? That's available for free. Obviously, still the people who can pay for better legal assistance always have some edge, but still valuable in having one, where a lot of people don't have.
Just curious, I know this is digressing again, but where would you see a legal assistant helping the average person in the way that a medical assistant would?
Well, I mean, look, most people can't afford lawyers. So, like, for example, they sign rental contracts without knowing what's in them.
Mm,
They
okay.
don't know when they have an ability to take a legal action or not, or what the kind of things to do are. They don't necessarily know what their rights are. If a collection agent is talking to them, there's all kinds of things that go on there.
Okay, actually, since South Park is very topical right now, there was this South Park episode many years ago, I think called like Human Centipede, where anybody who signed like the iTunes agreement, unknowingly was committing themselves to be part of a human centipede, if you remember that horror movie. And I can see this would be a great case where you have the AI legal assistant looking over your shoulder to just skim through the terms and conditions of everything you sign.
So, yes, exactly. And look, there's just all kinds of places. Well, look, part of why we have laws is we live in a society where we have, um, obligations, responsibilities, entailments with each other, with society, and so forth. And part of the ways when I have lawyers to help navigate that, and this becomes a much easier way to navigate all that. Anyway, one part of that is kind of this knowledge of, what are my available options, what are my rights, how am I self-possessed, and so forth. And AI can help with that. And then there's capabilities in terms of doing stuff. Like, say, for example, we're on a legal theme. I want to write a letter to say, hey, you did me wrong, legally. Well, AI can help you write the letter, right? And kind of cross check that and so forth. And so that extends capabilities. Um, and and so I think that 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 that's part of the individual agency, and obviously, that was the specific question, and then the super agency in part, just so people think about it, is to not only think about individual agency in terms of individuals, but also what happens with our agency when we all get it together, or when a lot of us get it together. And part of super agency is the thesis that when we have a broad based technology for many of us, that all of our agencies go up, not just because of our own individual capabilities with it, but because your capabilities with it. And so with like cars, created super agency as well. And I think AI has that capability of kind of right uh, uh, raising all of our agencies, not just by us individually, but what happens when many of us are all raised together. And a very last point, people say, well, but isn't AI going to differentially help the the um the wealthier or someone else? And the answer maybe yes, but it's also like a smartphone. And Tim Cook has the same smartphone, that some of your Uber drivers do, because when it's that broadly provisioned, we all get the same one. There isn't actually, in fact, any particular benefit to give one person a much better one, because it's much better to be for the hundreds of millions, and the billions for doing this. And I think that's part of the increase of agency we'll be having with super agency. Anyway.
And part of this New York Times guest essay, though, was that AI will enhance individual agency by always watching us. And I think this also connects with the digital twin experiment, where your digital twin kind of knows everything you know. And how does AI, by knowing so much about us, amplify agency?
Um, well, it's again the kind of broadly the two elements that I just mentioned, at least the two elements I just mentioned, which is one, kind of helping you know yourself and what kinds of things you might want and might be available to you, and then the one is helping get them, helping move to that. And by knowing you, it can both suggest the first and be a good companion catalyst in here are the things that you might want and might consider, and then in doing them, and in finding your way to them and making that happen. Part of the like as a very simple example, I tend to use deep research from AI every day, and part of that kind of deep research is because I'm learning and doing things, and that enablement to do that, to say, hey, I've got this question around this, particular project that I'm working on. Well, part of what AI deep research gives you is a pretty amazing, very quick research assistant to help you sort through things.
For the time we have remaining, I really want to talk about employment and economics and AI. And this is particularly for me a major issue. So we've talked a bit about academia. Um, I'm an academic at this point. I'm getting a PhD here at Stanford. And we've talked about law. I'm starting law school here in a couple of weeks too. And once upon a time, I toyed with the idea of going to med school and being a psychiatrist. And that's still, I mean, there are still pathways to becoming one.
Mhm.
And all of these things appear like they can be displaced by AI.
Mhm.
So, could we just, to satisfy my curiosity, I'm curious what your thoughts are about how academia will change
Sure.
in the years to come because of AI.
Well, the short answer is massively, although I think academics is a very, part of its being a, you know, uh, university professors being a centuries long institutions. It's one of the oldest things that exist, and along with cities and religions and whatnot, they tend to be very resistant to change. And part of it tend to be like, no, we're going to keep doing the things we're doing now.
And please be brutal. I've kind of come to the conclusion that this is not a viable career pathway anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's not viable the way it is right now. It'll change massively. Um, the uh, I think the old industrial paths of for example, the way that we teach is we hand out some books, people come to lectures, they submit written essays, and they do written exams. I think that's all uh, not long for this path. I don't know if it's small n years or very resistant institutions longer, but obviously the ability for AI to do very intense one-on-one education is is extremely important. The ability for AI to do one-on-one assessment is extremely good. Obviously, it can do, AI can actually even lead seminars and all the rest. So I think that this will all be transformed, and also obviously, to whatever degree the savant super intelligence involves, helping research is there too. And so all of this stuff really changes, kind of academics. Now that being said, um, I could easily see a universe where you say, look, all individual um, learning, teaching, and assessment is done by AI, but there's still a bunch of role for human beings in doing stuff. It's like facilitating seminars, seeing if the target of, like what kinds of things should we be assessing for? How should the assessment be driven? Are people engaging the right way in the learning and teaching process? What are the ways that we might prompt different options with AI for making that happen? I think there's a variety of things. I think doing research and thinking about, philosophical thoughts, for example, is still a viable thing, even in quite advanced, kind of savant, super intelligent circumstances. But I think the notion of, like the 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 way that we've had universities be, uh, this kind of multi-century bulwark, I think AI is the most amazing learning and idea development technology we've created in history, and that's going to completely transform how they work.
I wonder if rather than speaking about philosophy professors, speaking about mathematics professors might be easier in a certain way because whether or not it really is feasible, it's I don't know, maybe easier to imagine AI solving extant mathematical problems than it is to think of them solving all philosophical problems. And in a future where AI is just so much better than Terry Tao and any other great mathematicians, is there a role for math professors doing research at universities in the same way that they're doing today?
Well, I mean, there's this interesting question. It depends a little bit on what the savant stuff does. I mean, there could very well be just like, and look, in one simple form, we have more people watching chess tournaments than we've had in history, and yet computers are the best chess players. So there could be roles even, for math research and everything else, even if computers were the best math researchers. So it's, there's there's a many different ways the world could be. That being said, while there has been some good, um, kind of, um, work from Google and from others about like, doing math research and math Olympiads and so forth, we're still a fair ways off from these AIs actually, in fact, anywhere substantively really pushing these kind of research barriers, and not just with math. I mean, I think, for example, if you go use ChatGPT 5, deep research, you get some really amazing results, but it's still not the same thing as the thing that a highly qualified human being doing real work, can get to. Now, it can accelerate that human being a great deal. So again, it depends on where these super savants, get to and how broadly they get. And it's very possible that there's a number of different domains, one of which might be math, or some areas of physics or other things. But there's a sorry about that. Um, there's a number of areas where, kind of this, um, these kind of areas might actually, in fact, have a fairly long participation of human beings. Like one is by themselves, but the other is, of I actually think person plus machine will actually have a much longer lifespan than people who gesture at the chest analogy will have. I mean, there was this funny brief period where there was like, okay, humans better, computers better, humans plus computers better, and that was a brief human plus computers. But one of the things about chess is a kind of a rare, very specified environment. It has zero epistemological uncertainty. Everybody knows the same board. It is a very determinist fitness function and a very limited environment to be operating in, even though there's a lot of configurations and movements. And I think life is different. And I think that will give a much broader range for the person plus machine being a higher competence fitness function than just the machine.
Speaking of this partnership and the long-lived possibility of humans and machine working together, I I mean, you've told young people that their strength in the job market would be their status as AI natives. And I'm wondering, like, just take me for example, again, somebody who might be interested in law or medicine or academia. Where does being an AI native fit into the future of these fields?
Well, to some degree, I mean, we don't know exactly how the field will go, but part of the thing is human organizations change, kind of slowly and resistantly. And part of being young, like for example, going into a law firm, going, I know how to use AI, right? Is like, and I'm going to help like revitalize our work processes, what we do, what the targets are, how we look, how you even gain and grow customers may very well be very different, in a AI process with law and all the rest. And so the um uh and so the kind of this process of these things may actually in fact be um kind of uh central to how this works. Like I don't have a simple answer, but I think the path of the answer is by engaging with it and using the fact that you have the kind of younger, more AI generation, AI native experience to help bring about the future is then helpful to your career path, to organizations, to why people might pay you, et cetera, et cetera. And that what the new career paths are being created. Now for me, you know, today, and also if I'm younger like you, that would be exciting versus concerning. But I do understand that people have concern about the oh shit, we're creating the new path. I'd rather just learn it and do it. And it's like, yeah, we're in a creation moment.
The last thread I'd like to tug on today involves taking advantage of your expertise as an entrepreneur and an investor in this space. And also, it's tied to economic uncertainty. But for anybody who has some capital to spare, how would you go about if you were just a retail investor, which you're not, but if you were just a retail investor, how would you go about trying to leverage these great advances in AI and AI driving a lot of future economic gains through investment?
Well, I mean, I am an investor and doing stuff, but look, I think part of it is when you invest in capital, you're trying to invest in things where, you it's like public market, you buy a share at a dollar, you hope the share price goes up, etc. Part of how you choose things is the pattern of where you think technologies, products, and services will be successfully delivering the future behind people who are or organizations that are building them, and you think they're going to be economically differentially successful. That's the abstraction of that. And I think that part of that is to like be thinking like investing is a competitive game. It's like, for example, you hire some people to be lawyers, not others. You hire some people to be doctors, not others. I can't say, "Hey, I'm a doctor. Pay me to be a doctor." It's not just because of licensing; it just doesn't work that way. So it's like, well, where do you have a differential like edge in investing? Um, do you have access to a certain pool of talent? Do you have a better kind of judgment? Do you have a better understanding of a market? All of that kind of goes into it. And part of how, AI is changing all of that. And you may also have a differential use of AI as a tool for identifying, for driving, and you have something that you're doing. But you have to think about it as a competitive game. And part of it is that competitive game is like, how like, I use a poker analogy frequently when training investors or getting people to think about investing is like, in a poker table, if you can't spot the sucker, you are the sucker because it's a competitive game. And if you're the weakest, you're the person who's net contributing money, and you should opt out of that poker table. You want to play at poker tables where you're the strongest person. And that's the same kind of competitive advantage question that we have in a variety of economic questions in the field. And so that's the kind of thing to be looking at, given how AI is changing investment. And then you have to look at what are your competitive advantages.
Well, it sounds quite broadly like the person that I am describing, the random retail investor, they're not going to have the competitive edge when it comes to investing in AI. So it sounds like I'm putting words into your mouth here. You would say find some place where you have a competitive advantage. If you work in, I don't know, the textile industry, maybe cotton futures are your game, but unless you're close to Silicon Valley in some way, maybe tech isn't the right space for you to be investing in.
Or if you knew the cotton industry, for example, do you understand how the AI technology wave is going to transform the cotton industry and what bets you would take or not bet because of that? Right. If you also understand AI. But yes, I wouldn't walk up to some kid at Stanford and say, "Are you working on AI? Here's some money to invest." That's not the not not a good way to do it. It's part of the reason why, you know, people put in a lot of energy to being professional, like professional tech investors or professional, executives or other kinds of things as ways of doing that. So it's a um, and it's one of the reasons why in the private investment arena we have this notion of an accredited investor, which is private companies are not supposed to take money from people who aren't accredited investors, which are you know signals of a certain amount of expertise and a certain ability to lose money for doing it.
Well, without getting into the specifics of companies, and this is your area of expertise, are there any sectors of the economy that AI will be applied to where you expect that it will have outsized economic gains? Like I'm assuming medical research is one of them, given what we talked about with Manus.
So, um, look, I think the productivity implications from AI are massive. I think that every person who uses language in a working environment will get amplified. There will be co-pilots for everything that involves use of language and information, maybe even more, but that's the minimum. And that's a broad set of things. Like you mentioned, cotton industry. So, well, the supply chain and so forth, all physical bits, but analysis of supply chain, risk factor analysis, meetings, financial, sales and marketing, you know, those are all use of language. And so I tend to think there's going to be massive productivity increases across all of the stuff. As a matter of fact, part of your earlier legal thing, I think the whole notion of how law is going to apply is going to get much more sophisticated because we have these, and it will be the whole legal activity and profession and accountability and liability will all change because of AI in doing this. And so I think the productivity increases across all this stuff is going to just be massive. And part of the way to understand it is, you know, the notion of individual work is going to be there may still be individual human work, but individual human work working with agents as a way of playing this out. And so I think that again, the productivity uh, amplication is going to be massive. Now, I think it's more massive the closer you are to the world of bits, the world of knowledge, the world of information, because it's more natural. So, like for example, yes, financial analysis for the cotton industry, much slower for the physical manipulation of the world of it. Doesn't mean it doesn't bleed into that, but those are the kinds of transformations I think we'll see.
Reed, this has been a really excellent conversation. I'm a total neophyte in these areas, so I'm really thankful that you let me pick your mind for me and the audience today. So thanks again.
Well, my pleasure, and I look forward to when this comes out.